Okay, so this is an overview of chapter 16, one of the really interesting chapters, I think, because it focuses on varieties of sexual expression. And um, I hope that you will find it interesting as well. And I hope that you keep an open mind as well in terms of how we identify what is um, normal or what we consider to be deviant sexual behavior. So, two early ideas. In 1906, a doctor by the name of Croft Ebing defined sexual deviance as any instance in which a person or persons are having sex and they're not trying to procreate. Okay. Now, of course, not a whole lot of people still accept or think that that's a great definition of sexual deviance, but during his time, a lot of people did. Freud, Sigmund Freud, also had an idea, and his idea of sexual deviance was any time that um, individuals are having sex and there is no love there. That is, that sex needs to be part or should be part of a loving relationship. He considered it to be the bedrock of civilization, and so he believed that if people were having sex and it wasn't a loving within a loving relationship, then that was trivializing or degrading love. Um, one of the things for us to keep in mind is that sexual behaviors either increase or decrease in popularity. It really just depends on the point in time. We've talked before about norms and values and how those things change over time, and indeed they do. And so we may be more troubled at one time by certain types of sexual activity or behavior than we are at other times. So I'd like us to think of it as, sexuality as being a continuum of things that are very acceptable, things that are less acceptable, but not necessarily thinking of them as normal, because who really who really can say what normal is? Paraphilias are identified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. It's in its fifth edition, came out in 2013. And paraphilias are identified by the American Psychiatric Association as being sexual behaviors that involve a craving for an erotic object that is unusual or different. And so there aren't any classic profiles for people who are more likely to be diagnosed with the paraphilia, but they are typically male. Other than that, they come from every socioeconomic bracket. They come from every ethnic and racial group, various, every sexual orientation. Paraphilias can occur in just about any group you can think of. There are 8 conditions that are identified in the DSM-5, and we'll get to those in a bit, but they're listed there for now. Uh, One of the things about paraphilic disorders is that they're not considered a disorder according to the DSM unless a person feels distress for at least 6 months about this unusual sexual interest, um, or has a sexual desire or behavior that involves distress, injury, or death of another person, or has a desire for sexual behavior that does not involve consent with a partner or with someone else. And a recurrence and intensity of this sexual behavior are also key. Um, there is some controversy over whether the term paraphilia is a value judgment made by society, or whether it's a true psychiatric or clinical category. And I leave you to consider that issue. So one of the key ideas about paraphilias that psychiatrists believe in is that one of the key characteristics of a person who has a paraphilia is that that individual is able to distance themselves, that is, to remove themselves from any having to really deal with or have a complex sexual contact with somebody, and that the paraphilia enables the person simply to have sexual arousal and even orgasm, perhaps, without having to deal with the human element. Because all human interactions are complex, not just sexual ones. But when you have a partner, how you communicate with that person can often be complex. And paraphilias, it is argued, allow a person not to have to deal with that part. So there are some theories that try to explain how or why paraphilias may develop. And so first off are biological theories. And biological theories are this idea that there are perhaps some physical or neurological or physiological conditions that create a situation whereby the person may be more susceptible to developing a paraphilia. And so, things such as, having a brain tumor that presses upon a certain part of the brain might cause paraphilic behavior, or disturbances in the brain structure or in the brain chemistry, that these might cause a person to engage in paraphilic behavior. But one thing that psychiatrists, agree upon is that that's probably just a small number of why some people are paraphilic. The vast majority don't fall into that category. Psychoanalytic theory, of course, this is based on Freud's work. And so psychoanalytic theory, if you recall some of Freud's theories, the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, penis envy theory, etc. So for Freud, paraphilias can be traced back to a time in an individual's infancy and early childhood where the individual had difficulty navigating naturally through the Oedipal complex or the Electra complex, or there was some sort of castration anxiety. And so psychoanalytic theorists argue that this is why paraphilias are so much more common in men. It's because boys have to painfully separate from their mothers, the Oedipal complex, to establish a male identity. Developmental theory here is an interesting idea because it's really this idea that we have a capacity to experience almost anything around us in our social environments as erotic, as sexually arousing. And so one key idea here is Dr. John Money's idea of love maps. And Dr. Money argues that what we hear, auditory, what we feel, various materials or fabrics, etc., and also visual stimuli that we experience during childhood sex play might form a template or a foundation that defines for us not only our ideal lover, but also our ideal sexual behaviors. And so, a child, for example, he argues, who's punished for normal sexual curiosity, because all children are curious about their bodies and the bodies of others. If the child is punished during this stage for the sexual curiosity, that this may create such a trauma for the child that the love map is disrupted. And so then the child then focuses his or her attention on an ideal lover or sexual situations that are unnatural or atypical. Behavioral theories are based on psychology, of course, and the basis of behavioral theories is that a person is more likely to continue to do something if we give them a reward, because that's what we want them to do, or the person also might be less likely to do something simply because we punish that person. This is called conditioning. And so for behavioral theorists, when they think about paraphilias, they really focus on this idea that sexual pleasure is one of those areas where perhaps the type of sexual arousal or even sexual activity is experienced with pleasure because of the conditioning, because of the positive reinforcement that the individual experienced while sexually aroused or while engaging in particular sexual behaviors. Um, and then there's sociological theory, which is my favorite, of course. And that's simply this idea that we are influenced by all of our social environments as we're growing up. And the reality is this, I think this is the reality, that we're bombarded in a number of ways in music, hip hop, rap, but also in movies, in rom coms, in other sexually explicit themes in movies, in books, in magazines, even in commercials. Carl's Jr. commercials are very sexualized, typically, or toothpaste commercials, or shaving commercials, or even I remember seeing years ago a commercial for Dove chocolates where the woman was on a couch and sensually unwrapping a chocolate, and then as she tasted the chocolate, making sounds as though she was, having sex, having this orgasmic experience while eating her chocolate. And so, for sociological theories, the idea is that all of these things, these images and information that we're exposed to, can perhaps influences us in terms of how we think about sex and what's normal and what's achievable, etc. So now we get to the fetishistic disorders, and a fetish when a person has a fetishistic disorder, that means the person is sexually aroused by an object, an inanimate object, or even a body part. And so, listed there are some common objects of people who have a fetishistic disorder. May focus on shoes, particularly high heel shoes, thigh high boots, bras, panties, other types of clothing. Um, Different fabrics, maybe leather, silk, fur, rubber, even, or body parts, feet, hair, breasts, buttocks, thighs, even the backs of knees or elbows or shoulders are parts of the body that some people who have a fetishistic disorder are aroused by and maybe even be able to reach orgasm um, by having that thing present. And so a fetishist often will need to have the item present for arousal. And sometimes they do it with a partner. So they ask their partner to wear a particular type of clothing or a particular fabric or to play up a particular body part. Um, or the fetishist can simply um, have sex or masturbate while touching the object. And I saw a documentary on National Geographic, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, in which they focused on different individuals who have fetishes that are very interesting. One man, he has a fetish for his cars, and he gave them names, and he washes them, and he does it very sensually, and he essentially masturbates while not massaging his cars, but touching his cars and waxing them. He's able to have an orgasm. It also focused on a woman who um, makes love to the Berlin Wall. She goes out to the Berlin Wall and she kisses it and massages it and rubs up against it and tells it she loves it, and she's able to reach orgasm because she is aroused by the Berlin Wall in Berlin, Germany. So again, give me anything. Um, Transvestic disorder. Here, um, uh, trans means to go from one thing to another. Vest is referring to clothing, and so somebody is a transvestite is a person who likes to cross dress. The issue here, though, is um, because so many more men are diagnosed with transvestic disorder, that this is perhaps more of a value judgment of society and its inability to accept gender fluidity than a true disorder. Because if you think about it, women can wear pretty much whatever they want to, and they don't seem to have an issue with how they dress. There's a lot more flexibility for women. On the other hand, men get less flexibility. So in the text, there's a picture of Rihanna who wore a see-through evening gown to an award ceremony, and you could see everything: her breasts, her areolas, her nipples, her buttocks. She had a boa in the picture covering her genitalia, but if she moved that, you could see move the boa, you could see that too. And I strongly doubt that if a man wore a see-through tuxedo to an award ceremony, that that would be okay, and that he would be lauded as being a fashion icon, whereas Rihanna was lauded for being a fashion icon. So again, it's something just to consider. Is this more to do with social norms or values than a true, mental health issue? Sadism and masochism, two interesting ideas. And so sadism is when a person gets sexual arousal from either physical or psychological punishment or suffering of another person. And sadism is a term that's derived from the Marquis de Sade, who during his lifetime, he lived in the 19th century, spent a lot of his life in prison, primarily because he not only sexually assaulted many of his partners, he was also accused of having killed several of his partners. But he had a lot of time on his hands, obviously, he's in prison. And so he was able to write books, and where in his books, they were essentially his fantasies, since he couldn't have sex anymore. He was by himself in this prison. It's not really a cell. His family had money, so they paid for him to have a nice place to stay in the prison. But he essentially wrote novels about his own fantasies, and he was able to get those smuggled out. A friend of his printed them and sold them, and they were quite popular. So it turns out that even though not everyone wants to do what he did, they were interested in reading about brief stories, these short stories in which a character did this to partners. Sexual masochism disorder. This is when an individual, so if you're a masochist, you want or you enjoy, you get sexual arousal from being humiliated or beaten or being made to suffer or being tied up. And so there's a term that's sadomasochism, which is when two people, one a sadist, one a masochist, practice sexual behavior together. And so the sadist punishes or humiliates or in some way beats or tortures the other person. And so masochism is derived from the novelist Sasheer Mossack. And Mossack believed that women were created to subdue men's animal passion. So a lot of his novels focused on, men who had all this animal passion and the women who had to punish them in order to subdue the men's animal passion. Bondage and discipline, B&D. This is also known as bondage and restraint. This is, of course, when people maybe use things like flagellation or caning or hot wax or ice or biting, just, some sort of behavior in which there's some sensory deprivation or there's some humiliation, some verbal abuse, things like that. And then there's BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, and masochism, which is much more common because you're putting these things all together. In fact, BDSM is it's more common than you think. There are lots of YouTube videos that tell you, how to begin incorporating some of this into your own lovemaking with a partner. There are books that you can buy that explain this. It isn't all, some sort of strange dungeon-like thing. In fact, I think that movie, well, the books and then the movies, 50 Shades of Grey, none of which I read or saw, but focused on this idea that while initially the female was reluctant, eventually she came around to wanting to engage in these behaviors as well. And so I think that those books and that movie brought to the forefront this idea that, hey, it's not as strange as people have thought it is. For BDSM, and I would argue even for sadists and masochists as well, if it's consensual, and it should be if it's being done, there has to be a safe word. There should be a safe word because if one person is getting just a little bit too harsh with the punishment or with the degradation of the partner, and the partner wants it to stop, then the person upon whom the behavior is being inflicted should be able to have a safe word that is understood to mean that the other person needs to ease up or to stop. Exhibitionistic disorder. Exhibitionism is when a person becomes sexually aroused from displaying their genitals or showing nudity or their sexuality to strangers. Again, this is a picture with Rihanna here. Yeah, so this is what I meant to be talking about with Rihanna. You can see here she's wearing the see-through gown, evening gown. And if she didn't have that bow in front, you could see her genitalia. You could certainly see her buttocks on the back. If a man showed up wearing something similar, like a suit like this, I don't think that it would have been acceptable. And so far more men are arrested and convicted of exhibitionism than women are. And again, I think women are cut some slack here. In fact, I think it's during Mardi Gras when women are encouraged to, flash their breasts during Carnival. And they do, and no one's arrested. But if men were flashing their genitalia, that'd be probably a different story. Voyeuristic disorder. Voyeurs are individuals who achieve sexual gratification from watching unsuspecting persons either dressing, undressing, bathing, even engaging in sexual activity. Of course, this is a felony. It is a sex crime. Troialism is just a nice fancy word created by the American Psychiatric Association. It really is what most of us would call orgies. So sexual encounters or sessions in which multiple partners have sex. Frauderistic disorder, again, maybe a double standard here because you notice that the definition is a man rubbing his genitals against a woman's thighs or buttocks in a crowded place. So seemingly women cannot engage in frauderism because it doesn't say a person, it says a man. So something to think about there. Toucherism, the compulsive desire to touch strangers with one's hands for sexual arousal. And then pedophilia or pedophilic disorder. Here we're talking about individuals who get intense sexual arousal from engaging in sexual behaviors or even just viewing videos or looking at magazines or pictures of children, prepubescent, meaning children who have not yet entered into puberty, and pubescent children, those who have just entered into puberty. This is illegal in every country, and of course, time has varied over this. Whether or not this has been viewed as good or bad or acceptable has varied over time and across cultures. There is an organization that is quite interesting. If you ask a lot of pedophiles, they'll tell you, this has been something that's been going on for centuries. It's just that society has changed its ideas, but eventually it'll go back to the way it was. And they're really referring to pederasty that was practiced during ancient Greek times. So there's this organization. It's called the North American Man-Boy Love Association. They support the abolition of age of consent laws. Their argument is, look, we have these relationships with young children, and it is a relationship that is entered into freely by the child, by ourselves, and it benefits both of us, is their argument. Recidivism rates are high. And so one of the statistics we know from the APA is that 35% of victims of childhood abuse are pedophiles. Pedophiles often have other related factors, low self-esteem, poor social relationships, alcoholism, exaggeration of the social male role, arrested psychological development, etc. A couple other paraphilias are zoophilia, or also known as bestiality, sex with animals, and necrophilia. Some people enjoy or sexually aroused by having sex with dead persons. I'm going to leave you with this thought. What criteria should society use in deciding what is normal or acceptable? There are many people who think, well, religion should be one of the big influences. Other people say, well, popular opinion is probably the best. Other people say, well, let's let the courts hammer out a definition of what normal is. And others say, well, psychiatrists have been doing this a long time. We should probably go with what they think. But maybe it's not just one of those things. Maybe it's all of those things. And maybe, just maybe, paraphilias are part of human sexual diversity. And I don't mean the things that are illegal, like pedophilia or frauderism, etc., where there's no consent. Consider that if there is consent, if both people are adults, if they're doing this in private, whatever it is, maybe it isn't the APA's business or anybody else's business, as long as they are consenting, they're adults, and they're doing it in private. So consider urophilia. Urophilia, euro meaning urine, philia meaning love. There are some individuals who enjoy having their partner pee on them while they're having sexual intercourse. And while that might not be something that you or I perhaps want to engage in, that doesn't mean that because other people do that there's something wrong with them. Or consider, I'm trying to think of another one. Urophilia. Well, okay, these are like slang ones, but there's one called the blumpkin. And the blumpkin is when a male sits on the toilet and is defecating, and a female or other male, another male, somebody, is giving that male oral sex, is giving that person fellatio. The male sitting on the toilet is getting fellatio. Now, some people would say, "Oh, that's nasty." You're taking a shit, taking a dump, while you're getting fellatio, while you're getting a blowjob. That's disgusting. That's nasty. Maybe it is to some people. Now, while I'm not saying I want to try any of this, I'm simply saying, look, if other people like that, then is it really my business to judge what they do as good or bad, right or wrong? If it's two adults, they're doing it in private, and they're both consenting. So I leave you with that.